Okay.
Take a little bit of your time very shortly. I saw that some of you already grabbed the issue of Visegrad Insight. It's distributed for free at the CE Forum. Just to show it again, these copies. It's a fourth edition of our magazine, which is a special production by editors from 4 countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. Marta Simečková, Eva Karady, Martin L. from Czech Republic, Marek Sečkaš from Host magazine in Czech Republic, Mace Zombory, and our editors from Republika Nova. I'm editor-in-chief of Polish quarterly Republika Nova. I'd like to briefly point it out that this is the first time release of this freshly printed magazine that just arrived at Bratislava, and I saw it for the first time here in the morning. You can look through it, where we focus this time on the question of solidarity, instruments of solidarity, of how basically what will be the future of caring one after another. What we see is already a problem connected to many of the changes in the world, among others the demographic changes. So we report on the baby doom and the responses about baby doom, not baby boom, in the region. The responses in the governments, in think tanks. There is a report, there is a sort of a policy manifesto by one of our editors of what should be changed in terms of social security and social, the welfare state, the social policies around the Visegrad countries, but not only. If we want to upkeep the social standards and the level of integration and the instruments and the institutions of caring for one another, or how it will change, how our societies will change otherwise. There are 3 more points that I'd like to highlight, and then I take a seat and listen to a very great panel that is upcoming. The one is democracy assistance. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but we found out, and we're debating that in this issue, that Visegrad countries, for 10 years now, have been putting quite a lot of money into development aid, meaning building wells and bringing democracy to different parts of the world. Now the thing is that 10 years ago it was about $250 million put by our 4 governments together, of course separately, but if you calculate it together, to all this development aid and democracy assistance around the world. But this year it's reaching $1 billion. But still we don't have a public debate about that. So we encourage you to read it and have a quick look, and also discuss it in your circles and discuss it in the national agendas about what the democracy assistance and the money put into this and the development aid, what is it all about, why do we do it, what's the direction it's going to take. And there are a few other reports or texts and essays, among which there are 2 great interviews. I'd say, yeah. One with Karl Schwarzenberg, the other one with Adam Michnik, several others interesting pieces on the question of international politics in the eve of the Vilnius summit next week, in a fortnight. There will be a decision or no decision about what will happen to our eastern neighbors, Ukraine, especially in terms of the trajectory towards or not towards the EU. These questions are also being discussed in the theme, in the general light of instruments of solidarity. To add a footnote, the Visegrad Insight is a permanent project. It's a permanent program of the Visegrad Fund. It's sponsored by them, but we remain fully independent as editorial team, which was a precondition when we proposed 2 years ago to make it. We cooperate with Eurozine, and we also cooperate with Czech think tank Europeum that is running Visegrad Review, a website updated weekly on similar issues. I think that's more or less a brief introduction. Thank you again in the interest. We welcome your feedback, your critical comments, and your recommendations on social networks, where you can find these issues online, and you can recommend it to readers beyond Visegrad to grab a copy for their tablets, Kindles, and everything people use for reading today. So thank you once again for the opportunity to present it. And it's a great forum, and it's a great opportunity to be here.
Dobrý večer všetkým.
Good evening. It's the 16th of November. It has not started yet, but in literally a few hours it will start with the feeling of despair, resistance, with very weird feelings. We took out to the streets, and we are going to remember all that transpired at that time. The organizers of our conference have chosen as its English title the name that reminds of John Lennon's song, and they call this forum "Give Citizens a Chance." This reflects the gradual process that was named in English as breaking the spell or breaking the curse that we know very well in Slovakia under our own word odklinanie. We remember the electrical feeling we had when the Public Against Violence claimed that we as citizens should take the matters in our own hands. In about 1/4 of a century later, too many people in too many countries have found themselves on the opposite side to their initial hopes, because they today have the feeling they cannot get the administration of justice. They are not equal before the law. They cannot influence the system. But this is not something that is limited only to this part of the world. It also happens in older, more established democracies, where we are witnessing deep discontent with the way democracy works, how discontent with the quality of democracy, but also we witness issues related to capitalism as such, the widening gap between the rich and the poor, destruction of the fabric of society. And there are everywhere in the world there are people who want to do something about it, who want to prevail over this pessimistic trend. We are fortunate in having today people on our panel who have a very deep knowledge about both the diagnosis but also about the attempts to do about it, about the cure. They have various backgrounds, be it political activists, experts, writers, or people who have achieved incorporating these ideas into clear messages. I'll switch over to English to introduce our guests.
The group of well-known public intellectuals, they will reflect about civic activities that could either change or enrich the existing institutions of representative democracy. They will evaluate the state of civic participation, its successes and failures. They will offer their view on possible reconceptualization and their dreams about a better future. Please welcome our panelists, Lucinda Creighton, Justin Vedes, Justin Vides, Ales Debeliak, and Ivan Krastev. Lucinda Creighton is an Irish politician based in Dublin who can see and act clearly and decisively. Let me quote. We need to focus on what matters to people, what has the potential to change their lives and improve their future. The best ideas are often most simple and always the most logical. Recently, she left her former party and together with other colleagues, she formed the Reform Alliance, and we would love to know more what sort of reforms she and her colleagues have in mind. Justin Vedes is an activist, educator, media maker, and community organizer from Brooklyn. As he says, he is a stubborn optimist and sometimes workaholic. He has recently summed up the legacy of the Occupy Wall Street movement in an article for The Guardian. A new generation of game changers has found its calling, he writes, and isn't waiting for the political establishment to give them the go-ahead to take initiative. Sure, we face an uncertain future, but we embrace the chaos that defines our time, because there is no alternative but to challenge the status quo. 2 years ago, a new generation found its calling. We will continue to move forward peacefully and deliberately in order to take back our country, our future, and our dreams. Ales Debeliak, whom we were very fortunate to have also in the previous forums, in the previous years, the Slovene culture critic, poet, editor, educator, translator, and essayist based in Ljubljana. This summer he attended an interesting gathering which was called Annual Subversive Forum in Zagreb. And listen what he said there. Criminals disguised as statesmen were robbing us blind. Crisis made us realize this truth. And we will be very eager to hear from Ales what could be done with this state of matters. Ivan Krastev, our long-term plan, is a man with many hats, Bulgarian political scientist, chairman of his think tank, Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, board member of European Council of Foreign Relations, and also director of the Open Century Project in Budapest at Central European University. But first and foremost, absolutely brilliant analyst. Quotation, they captured the public imagination without bringing to life either a new ideology or charismatic political leaders. They will be remembered for videos, not manifestos, happenings, not speeches, conspiracy theories, not political tracks. We are witnessing an epidemic, sometimes it's happening, but it isn't clear if this is the beginning of something new or it is just the end of the status quo. So my first question to all of you is if you could please briefly summarize and evaluate the recent developments in your countries that are relevant to our topic, a chance for citizens. I think we could start in Ireland. We read today in newspapers that Ireland is coping quite successfully with the crisis. It means they will not require more money from the EU. At the same time, we would like to know more, what does it mean for citizens? And is just a decision of politicians and by politicians, or has civic society played a role in this? Please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, as you've said, I come from Ireland, and I think it's safe to say that we've been through a pretty traumatic period over the last 5 years or so. And many of you will be aware that we are one of the so-called programme countries. We entered our EU IMF bailout programme in 2010. And very shortly after that, we had our most recent general election, which took place in 2011, in February 2011. I suppose, I mean, the thing that struck me most at that time, I was a member of Parliament. I was a first-time TD or MP. Was the degree to which the government at the time continually denied that there were any problems, and we were repeatedly told that the country had sufficient cash reserves, that there was nothing to worry about, that the banks were adequately capitalised, and so on. All the while, the same individuals were negotiating with the IMF for a rescue package. So that angered Irish people naturally. I think there was a very strong and genuine sense of irresponsible risk-taking without any truth, without any genuine explanation to the public about what was happening, and I suppose furthermore no apology after it happened when they were proven to have been less than truthful. So for me, I suppose, I think the thing that matters most if we are to try to re-engage citizens, and certainly in my experience, Irish people are just, I mean, like across a lot of Europe, I mean, switched off, disengaged, unenthused, apathetic, and really feel that they can't change anything, that they have no control over the outcomes of the democratic procedures. So what they want to see, I believe, is more honesty, more truth and integrity, which is an often abused word in the political sphere, but it's something that really does matter. I think a sense that as a collective, that people can affect change, that they can take the reins of power, if you like, and actually use them to good effect. And they want to see people in public life who are prepared to do that, who are prepared to take sacrifices, who aren't simply going to go with the flow, and who aren't necessarily going to act out of self-interest or self-preservation in the political sphere. That all sounds great. It's very difficult to achieve. What you asked me specifically about, well, two things. One is we're exiting our bailout programme on the 15th of December. Is there jubilation, is there elation on the streets of Dublin and the streets of Cork and the streets of Galway? The answer is no. Our government made an announcement in the last 48 hours to the effect that we wouldn't apply for an emergency or for a credit line, a safety net, if you like, when we exit our bailout programme. And this was marketed and received, I should say, by the political journalists as a huge success for the government. But when you turned on the radio and you listened to the vox pops of citizens on the streets, 1 in 5 thought this was a really good thing, and 4 in 5 really didn't care. So 80% of people didn't see this as significant at all. So, I mean, that gives you a sense, I think, of how disconnected politicians are from their electorates. And
Reform Alliance somehow tries to change it in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's early days. I mean, it's simply a group of like-minded parliamentarians who have come together because we're frustrated by the lack of change. to state the obvious. So we've come together just in the last 8 weeks or so to try to find a way to start reconnecting with the public, to start bringing new thinking and new ideas into our national parliament, and trying to create a momentum so that either through pressurising the existing government or through the creation or formation of a new government in the next 2 or 3 years, that we can really do something different. So I suppose it's about using the position that we have as elected representatives to try to help to change and to. I mean, it's not a question of us saying that we have all of the answers or that we are the font of all wisdom, but rather that we want to see a much more open-minded system that isn't beholden to vested interests and isn't about self-preservation, but is more about facilitating new thinking, new ideas, so that we can reach a new path.
We see a lot of similar developments, not only in this part of the world, but also in some other countries, that there are new political groupings emerging and somehow changing their parties, creating new parties or new movements or new initiatives. So in this context, your attempt is quite similar to other similar events. Justin, well, not only you are saying that you are an optimist, but you have, I would say, fascinating work behind you, which attracted a lot of attention, not only in New York and America, but also in the world. And you are now also involved in several educational reforms. So could you tell how do you see it right now, and what are the chances and prospects?
Well, I think to begin, my country has a long, rich history of democratic tradition. Originally, it was only for a very small subset of people in the country. If you were white and you owned land, you could vote and participate in democratic society. The democracy behind that, though, was a radical notion for the founders of my country. And all of the social movements since then, almost all of them, have focused around growing the subset of people who can be politically involved in my country, from the abolition movement to the women's suffrage movement, which earned women the right to vote, to the civil rights movement, which earned African Americans the right to vote. And not just the right to vote, but other political rights that protect their participation in democracy. But I think that in the last few years, there's been a growing disillusionment with American democracy amongst young people in my country, which runs in parallel to what we're seeing in Europe and in other places amongst many young people. And it's a very interesting question why that is. You might expect that the development of political rights in the United States had reached a sort of pinnacle that encouraged the most participation. But I believe that now the question lies as much in economic rights, economic participation, as in political rights, and both of those are related to democracy. And so we see a growing distrust in politics and politicians in the United States. Part of that is what led to the Occupy Wall Street protests, and also many, many years of what I would call ineffectual protest. In other words, large mobilizations like the anti-war movement, which did not have any sort of effect upon politicians in terms of trying to prevent war in Iraq or Afghanistan. And so in the face of that, there's a growing cynicism, a growing skepticism that regular people can have a say, can have any kind of influence in their government. And like I said, especially amongst young people. And I think that one of the reasons why young people especially are becoming more disillusioned with government is a technological reason. I think that with advances in technology, a lot of young people are feeling a huge increase in sort of their agency and their abilities and powers to affect the world around them, but they're not seeing a corresponding political agency increase. So they can speak with new friends and people who share their interests all around the world. They can organize Facebook groups and take to the streets and all of these things, but it doesn't guarantee them any sort of increased political power. And they're quite disillusioned, so they may not be voting. And that is a sort of vicious cycle in and of itself, which is discouraging more people from voting. And so there's a real sense of powerlessness, of lack of agency amongst young people. And I think one last trend that is amplifying this, accelerating this disillusionment, is the rising global inequality under this global capitalism, finance capitalism, especially in the last 5-10 years. And the financial crisis in 2008, which sort of laid bare the priorities of government, which is to prop up banks so that they don't fail, and to reward very risky behavior that hurts millions of people and pushes them out of their homes and brings instability to their communities, to reward this with bailouts and backstops and inherent promises of continued prosperity, even in the face of reckless behavior, and then no punishment, no justice for those who really do truly hurt people, especially the poorest people. And so a sort of new, young, politically conscious class is arising in the United States that I don't think we've seen since probably the 1960s. And in fact, many of the sort of the hippie activists and others from the 60s, they see in Occupy Wall Street and other allied movements a sort of resurgence of solidarity, of a political activism that they felt had sort of died in a way. And that is what brings me hope, because I do believe that there are ways to confront these problems that are democratic, that don't tend towards totalitarianism, that don't tend towards fascism, but that are in fact democratic. But it does require a political consciousness raising, a sort of popular education, which is why my focus has been and always will be around education, because it really is the responsibility of young people and all people to recognize that these are problems that are not other people's problems, but in fact our problems, that we're going to have to confront them, that we're going to have to fix them, that every generation leaves problems to its children and doesn't give them all of the tools necessarily to fix them. And that is the reality, and to own that problem, to own that crisis and confront it head on. I believe that's what we've been trying to do with Occupy Wall Street, and that's the one sort of light at the end of the tunnel that gives me hope for the future.
Yes, it's nice to hear about the light at the end of the tunnel. Alice, Slovenia has surprised us all. Usually the best pupil in the class, everything simply worked quite perfectly. And a couple of months ago, a year or 2 years ago, all of a sudden we saw a lot of people in the streets. We saw protests against corruption. Then we were 2 years ago watching that the party which was established only 3 weeks ago won the parliamentary election, Positive Slovenia. And even if they couldn't find partners at that time, now they have it, and you have the first woman prime minister. How do you see, with all your experiences in 70s and 80s and with all those 20 years of struggling, how do you see the recent developments, and can you put them in some context?
Yes.
Yeah. Borrow not only the words but the mic as well. I'm honored to be here, and I'm pleased to be able to share some of my meditations on the current state of affairs, not only in my country, but I dare say in Europe at large. But for the moment, let me stay on the question itself and limit myself to the country. Slovenia used to be part of former Yugoslavia. And I think that there was a story that dominated the public discourse in the 80s, and it was the effort to become a normal country. A normal country in the local parlance meant the West European type, capitalist and democratic. When in the second part of the 80s, the centrifugal forces that kept the fragile federation together, fragile albeit functioning federation together, began to dissipate. What was left was nationalism as the only game in town. And indeed it was nationalism that the elites in various parts of the now defunct country have reached for to mobilize the public at large and have succeeded in that admirably, if there's anything to admire about that. But certainly successfully having pulled the wool over the eyes of the expecting and agitated and excited citizenry at large, citizenry that wanted, as I said, to enter Europe. Never mind that the rallying slogan that did not only occupy the public mind in Slovenia, Yugoslavia, but also entire Eastern Europe, was the return to Europe. And the dark side, the flip side of this slogan was the retreat from the Balkans. And the Balkans was meant as the savage place, the place where people prefer weapons over the tools, where if you have a toothache, you pull it rather than heal it. So it was anything but what the population desired. In the process, in the so-called putative transition, supposedly toward democracy and capitalism, transition that consumed the better part of our lives, that is the last 20 years, had distinct winners. And those were political elites that succeeded in translating the economic conflicts into ethnic terms, having been able to manipulate, if you will, or rhetorically spin this story about the economic conflict into the ethnic conflict, successfully driving the wedge between various ethnicities that made up now defunct country. In the aftermath of the breakup, each and every newly established nation state reached not for the Republican set of ideas and the stock of meaning that is the equality in the face of law, but preferred to emphasize the ethnically grounded solidarity. So not solidarity in terms of political citizenship, but solidarity in terms of ethnicity. And that holds true across the board for all the not only successor countries to Yugoslavia, but also, I dare say, across Eastern European lands in the vast space between Riga in the north and Rijeka in the south, the Baltic and the Adriatic. And I think that the recent demonstrations over the last few years that have brought an unprecedented number of dissatisfied and disillusioned people to the streets was galvanizing to the extent that it did not only aim to topple the government, but whether that was a collateral benefit or was it intended, I don't know, and it's less relevant. But it opened up the possibility to discuss the variety of alternatives, because it has become quite clear that the narrative that was sold to us as the return to Europe, return to normalcy, the restitution of standard, everyday, boring life in capitalism was telltale, was a story that only helped to, as I said, make us look in the wrong way. And only now is it possible to realize that the narrative that was supposed to give some semblance of coherence and unity to the European peoples is in itself not sufficiently emotionally charged to really mobilize the people. And in the absence of that unifying narrative, population tends to reach for the solidarity grounded in ethnicity. And that's something that we should, of course, keep at bay and fight against if at all possible. The trouble, of course, emerges not the trouble emerges not with the government that is in the minds of a majority of the population doing a disservice to the pursuit of the public good, but the trouble begins when that kind of a government falls, and only then the vacuum shows its contours and shows its substance. A vacuum can have a substance, but it calls for filling it with alternative narratives because I think that the fact that the welfare state, which is part and parcel of the democratic capitalist order, the welfare state is something that has been sacrificed at the altar of globalization and austerity. The flip side of the austerity is the rising movements that can be easily characterized as proto-fascist, and it is tempting to see proto-fascist movements and their increased public voice they have as the continuation of the austerity measures by other means. And that is something that if there is one consensus, and with this I pass the mic back, if there is one consensus on a part of the demonstrating population in my country, and again I dare say elsewhere, then it is consensus about the fact that if the European Union in its enforced austerity measures assumes the role that the IMF played in Latin America in the 1980s and 1990s, that is, if it becomes the whipping, the hard whip on the back of the disenfranchised population, then EU will turn into a capital management agency, and Europeans will continue along the division that separates the industrious north, or the diligent ants on the one hand, and the lazy and non-active, as the sinister word is, non-active part, the south of Europe, that is relegated to the role of playing cricket.
Well, capital management institution, not extraordinary nice vision for Europe. Ivan, Bulgaria is a mystery because what we have seen is an incredible amount of civic activity, and even in this case with some results. It means to protest against the previous government, then to change it, then now protesting in the very last days, trying to occupy parliament, occupy a university, and so on. And you wrote a lot about this, so I'm not going to quote you. We would rather like to know more. How do you see it? What is the demonstration of what is the Bulgarian experience? Is it very unique, or is it to a certain extent similar? And what could be the outcomes of the recent events?
So thank you very much. In the late 1980s, Bulgaria made its first super production in the film industry, which of course was called as Paruha, and was about the foundation of the Bulgarian state, and it was 4 hours long. And we invited one of these famous Italian movie directors and showed him the film. And they said, "What do you think?" And the guy was very polite, and he said, "Listen, you're a small and charming country. Why you're not doing small and charming films?" Unfortunately, I don't believe that we are in the business of doing small and charming things. And the situation in Bulgaria, in fact, developed from bad to ugly, which is a totally different view of what's going on. I do believe also Bulgaria is quite interesting story for Europe. And just to have an idea, because I'm sure that very few of you are experts on Bulgarian politics, just to give you the feel of the country. At the moment, we have a government that have been elected 4 months ago. They enjoy the support of 20% of the population. 70% of the population asked for early elections. 63% declared that they have nobody to vote on these elections. The protests go against the government and against the opposition. People want this government to go, but the next not to come. No, I'm saying this because this is the result of a very special political story. Bulgaria is small and poor, in a certain way, slightly trivial place. Because you say that Bulgaria is dysfunctional, you're not making discoveries, you're not going to make a dissertation out of it, because this is the assumption. But if you look around, you're going to see in Bulgaria certain things that are very important for some of this post-succession politics. In the last 12 years, first of all, in Bulgaria, for the last 25 years of transition, never government was re-elected. It is easier to resurrect than to be re-elected. And people are using the elections simply to organize a public execution of a party in power, always with good reasons. Secondly, for the last 12 years, twice, extra parliamentary party won the elections. Party that have been created 6 or 8 months before the vote, winning majority. First was the king. You can say, listen, happens. 8 years later, it was the former head of the chief of the security detail of the king, who also did it. So for the last basically 12 years, Bulgaria has been governed from the right, from the left, from above the king, from below his bodyguard. And basically, what Bulgarians understood is that you can change governments, but you cannot change policies. Even more, what they understood is that being in the European Union allows you to vote totally responsible, because at the end of the day, nothing bad can happen, because the European Union should take care. The level of mistrust is really amazing. At the moment, 12% trust the Constitutional Court. One of the institutions that you assume that people trust because they don't know. 11% trust the Parliament. And the biggest story is what happened with this protest wave. February this year, really out of nowhere, because of high electricity prices, hundreds of thousands of people ended on the street. These people have been basically lower middle class. They were out of Sofia. Sofia was not part of this protest. They have been standing on the street, and what is very interesting, they didn't ask for the resignation of the government. They much more asked for lower prices. 7 people burned themselves to death. You have self-emulation. And what is the most striking is, if you see the logic of the protest, this is the middle-age type of protest. In when people basically go on the street, not because they asked to change the king, but because they want the king to see them. To try them, I cannot survive. Then the government of Prime Minister Borisov decided that in this situation it's better to leave. They did it, by the way, very quickly. They went on the elections and they won the elections. The governing party against which the protest was the #1 political party, because people on the street were against the government. They didn't have any trust in the Socialist Party. And basically the active population in the country does not very much, put it mildly, trust the Socialist Party, which is basically the party of the pensioners and several oligarchs. What happened was that then the Socialist Party, the Turkish minority party, with the support of an openly fascist party, because the word fascist is used these days basically for everybody, Ataka party is fascist in a banal way. They do believe that non-Bulgarians should do nothing in Bulgaria.
Like Ataka?
Ataka, no, this is Ataka. Ataka is supporting. The government survives because of the Ataka votes. So you have this strange coalition kept by shared hatred towards the previous government and by money. What they did, because this is the problem of ugliness. So from this point of view, Bulgaria is at least a classical story. Even in a bad American movie, the ugly guy is slightly ambivalent. So, for example, he's evil but good looking. Not in Bulgaria. Not in Bulgaria. 2 weeks after the government was elected, they decided to appoint a 32-year young oligarch whose mother controlled 70% of the printed media as the head of the counterintelligence. The only experience of this guy with the counterintelligence is that several years before he was investigated for corruption. And then people went on the street. And this is the second wave of protest, which was totally different. This time, Sofia was protesting, and the countryside was watching. 50, 60,000 people went on the street. It was a classical urban middle class. And these people said, no way. The government was shocked because there was so much living in their own world, they didn't realize what they had done. So they basically, of course, pushed the guy to resign. The guy was very much offended that people didn't get him. But the story is that since then, the government is basically trying to tell the people, we don't care where you stand. And basically telling Sofia is not Bulgaria and all this stuff, students ended up occupying the parliament. So, and here's my last point. Why in a situation like this you believe the government hopes that they can survive? And they have a good reasons to hope. Because this government knows very well that they're not going to be trusted by the people. So their message is not trust us. Their message is don't trust anybody. They said all these protesters, they're paid by other oligarchs. All these students in the street, they're paid by this and that. And people are ready to, in a certain way, believe any type of a negative message. And I do believe this is the major story. The major story is that in this situation of a total mistrust, and honestly speaking, new technologies very much contributed to this, because of course they're helping people to learn certain things, but there is also a flourishment of conspiracy theory. There is not a bullshit which cannot be believed. You end with a situation which people basically said, I cannot change anything. And if you cannot change anything, why do you change this government? For what? So the government is hated. You have a lot of police. In order to get the intellectual level on which we are discussing, there was a protest today, major demonstration organized this time by the opposition. The Prime Minister went on television and said, I'm going to fire all public officials who are going to join the protest. Listen, this is country member of the European Union. And the story is that the European Union is so much about the euro, so much about what's happening here and there, that you don't react. By the way, the European ambassadors have been joining and supporting the protest and so on. It was a message. It does not that they don't know what is good and what is bad. But the European Union basically started to feel like a Bulgarian citizen. They don't believe that they can change anything.
I'm just trying to recollect you. For a time you served as the Minister for European Affairs, right? And if you recollect these times and also your political career, what Ivan just said, do you see how the European institutions are ready and prepared and willing and capable to do something with it? And secondly, perhaps on European level, do you see some examples how to cope with this phenomenon, which is very common and very general, and it is a deep mistrust, not only to parties but to political class as such, to the whole political establishment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that currently binds the EU member states together is this mistrust of the system. I think the reasons are profoundly different. I mean, if you look at what's been happening in a certain number of the eastern and southeastern countries in terms of rule of law, in terms of corruption, in terms of those specific challenges are quite different to the challenges that have existed surrounding the euro and the euro crisis and so on. And I think you're right. I mean, the euro crisis has dominated everything, maybe with good reason, because I mean, we had the FT writing in I think it was November 2011 that the currency had 10 days to survive, which thankfully they were proven wrong. But I mean, it was that critical, and we were on the brink, and the economic effects on the whole of the European Union would have been catastrophic. I think, in a sense, the European institutions are really only beginning to wake up to the reality of many of the things that have been happening in Bulgaria, in Romania, and in other member states as well. And I mean, as Minister for European Affairs, we had the presidency from January to June, as you know, and I was participating in debates in the European Parliament every month, lengthy plenary debates, often from 9 o'clock in the morning till 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night. And in fairness, many of the MEPs put these issues on the agenda. But the response was always really, in essence, this is more of a matter for the Council of Europe than it is for the European Union. And partly, I think, because of the way in which the European Union is structured, which is that really key decisions and policy direction is given from the Council of Ministers or from the European Council. And no one member state wishes to criticise a government of another member state. No one member state wishes to sit around a table and look their counterpart in the eye and speak about breaches of human rights, rule of law, basic principles of democracy. Firstly, because we don't like to acknowledge that they actually exist in the European Union, and secondly, because it's uncomfortable and because it's not very diplomatic. And in the EU, I think, probably more than any other region in the world, the whole basis of the system has been about politeness from one member state to the other, by and large. And so nobody really wants to grasp this nettle. And I think that that's something that certainly is going to have to be addressed. I know that Viviane Reding, as Commissioner, has tried to some extent. She's not really received a huge amount of support. Some of the ministers in the Council have tried. Some MEPs have tried. But there hasn't been a momentum. And I think it's important now that we start to try to build that kind of momentum. But don't underestimate the challenges, because at the end of the day, to criticise your neighbour is to be slightly impolite, and we don't like to do that in Europe.
Yes, and especially after experiences with Haider, which didn't prove to be very successful, so maybe the countries are more reluctant. You don't have European Union, you have federal government, but...
well, sometimes we have it. It's been shutting down a lot lately.
Yeah. I was told that you attended also a meeting with the students here in Bratislava, right? And the talk was about the trust. Can you somehow move to this framework? Because what we are listening is what is generally known. The question is, what is your sense? What is your feeling, your intuition, or your experiences? Simply how to cope with it.
Well, I think I could have been in a classroom in Egypt or in Tunisia or in the United States or perhaps Bulgaria. The young people don't have trust in their government. Many of them don't have any interest in voting. Many of them, when I asked, are you hopeful for the future of your country? A young woman in the back started shaking her head no. And I asked her to explain, and she said, I have no hope, I'm going to leave the country. Which is not, it's not something unique to Slovakia.
To experience something similar in another country,
yeah,
yes.
I said to her, it's not much better outside of Slovakia. But the point I think that Ivan made is very relevant, is that when the trust is so low in the government from the start, if you look in the United States, the Congress has 5% approval rating. It's the lowest it's ever been. In 1776, in the colonies of America, before it was the United States of America, King George III had a higher approval rating than that. And then we had a revolution. So the point is that when it's so low, the politicians, instead of saying trust us, they say don't trust any of them, and it undermines the credibility of the entire system. And so there's really no way for them to crawl out of this hole that they've created, which again is why I say that we're going to have to own this problem as our own and not as the problem of the government, because they're not fixing it. And what we did in 2011 on Wall Street was to say we're not going to demand anything of the government because we don't think they can do anything about the problems. We're going to demand of each other, we're going to demand of the people that they rise up and confront this inequality, they confront this injustice, they confront this corruption and this this dysfunction themselves. And I think that is one of the most important notions of the Occupy movement in trying to bring agency to people by helping them recognize that they don't have to wait for politicians to fix the problems, because in fact the politicians, they don't know what to do. They don't have the solutions. They're just as clueless as we are, and they're being, bought off. So they have no interest in fixing the problems as long as somebody keeps slipping them some money.
Yes, and at the same time, even if this sort of orientation from bottom up sounds quite healthy, and there are hundreds of examples also here in Slovakia. Small initiatives, new projects, new people, new ideas. Quite often just a small group, 2-3 people, 10 people, and so on. They somehow understand that probably after almost a quarter of a century, state won't do it. So they really are returning to this principle to take their own issues in their own hands on the communal level, on the local level, and I also see a sort of inspiration here. But Ivan or Alice, would you like to respond or to react? What was that?
I just want to make two very simple points. First, just psychologically, when you have the feeling that the situation in your country is really bad, is not when you want to leave, but when you are out and you feel guilty for this. There is nothing particular about, and I'm saying this because for the last 10 years I have been very much enjoying the fact that I should not talk about Bulgaria anytime I go on the panel. Because coming from a small country, you end up as a professional Slovak or Bulgarian. This is very kind of depressing. After 1989, you're looking for somebody who speaks some English and knows that the Berlin Wall has fallen. And you're invited for this reason on conferences. And then comes the moment in which you understand that something extremely important is coming in a small place. And it's very difficult to explain it. Because I can understand all this enthusiasm about protest movements. But let's put it like this. By the way, what you're seeing with the students in Bulgaria these days is absolutely amazing. You have 300 students, which is not a lot. Even in the Columbia University occupation in 1968, at least 18% of the students have been supportive. And these people are standing there. They know that they're going to have a big problem if this is going to fall down. They're afraid that they're going to be some tax paid by the government who is going to beat them on the street. They have been beaten by the police, which is not the Bulgarian tradition. Bulgaria in this case is not Russia and is not Turkey. We are shouting at each other. We're not beating each other. They're staying there. But do you know where is the problem with them? All the good things that you're talking about is also their weak points. First, they're very much afraid to be seen as political. But listen, if you want to get the resignation of the government, what you're about? A cultural activity? Secondly, they're afraid to have leaders. Because we came with a culture in which leaders is bad. We are leaderless. But when you don't have a leaders also, it's very difficult to have negotiations. Because you can tweet a revolution, you cannot tweet a political process. And from this point of view, you have these kids, which are very much there. You have a lot of energy. You have a lot of... By the way, the government didn't manage to discredit the students yet, which is already amazing. And do you know why? Because people for the first time see somebody taking personal risk. Bulgaria is not famous for this. Bulgaria is not Poland. No, Bulgaria is not Poland. Even if you basically, to understand the nature of the Bulgarian communism, for example, you should go on the verbs. In Russia, when you speak in Russian, you are sitting in prison. In Bulgaria, you are lying. So it's much more relaxed. So from this point of view, but these kids took a personal risk. And I'm saying this because trust at this moment is not going to be rebuilt through performance when we talk about this type of very dysfunctional states. Trust is going to be kind of regained by personal risk-taking. And you see in other environments, basically, people like Navalny are trusted simply because he took a lot of risk. Only playing with your life in a situation in crisis, you can convince people to listen to you because they don't want to listen to this anymore. And I'm saying this because my last point is very much about what is in crisis. Listen, the fact that elites are distrusted, it's not a news. The fact that people are not kind of happy about political class, it's fine. The problem is that elections themselves started to be mistrusted. And election is the type of part of the democratic system which if you start to mistrust, you have a basic problem. Because people don't believe that changing a government makes a policy change. They don't believe that elections helps you to keep government accountable. In the case of the US, it's also very much the money problem, who votes, people, or check books. But also, in a strange way, elections before have been performing two very important things. They're creating the idea of a majority, and on the basis of this even imagined majority, you had the legitimacy to govern. Now the majority disappears on the night of the elections. President Hollande, good or bad, believed that he had a majority. 6 months later, he had a support of 20%. Because the loyalty to your own vote is very low. On the other side, normally elections help to demobilize of the opposition, basically saying, listen guys, you lost the elections, you should allow other people to govern. In the case of the US, losing the elections is not the way to demobilize the opposition. The Republicans said, we are not going to allow them to govern. And I do believe this is a major situation. And talking about the crisis of democracy, it's not enough to say that there is a civic energy. You can have a civic energy. By the way, there was a lot of civic energy in the Weimar Republic, on both sides, and a lot of civil society. Weimar Germany is the place with one of the highest level of associations and private initiatives and all these sport facilities and so on, and we know where they ended. So I do believe that because the situation is serious, we should talk kind of politically blunt, because it's very easy to say because kids on the street, and this is really nice kids. I mean, because seeing these people, you know what you were talking about. It's not enough, because this same new technology is very much empowered the far right in Bulgaria, and it's very extreme, and also very extreme in a very provincial way. We have 5,000 Syrian refugees these days in Bulgaria, and you have 90% of the Bulgarians believing that the country is going to basically cease to exist as the result of it.
Bulgaria may not cease to exist, but distrust, to put it mildly, or hatred, to put it strongly, of the immigrants is the name of the game across the European lands. Recall, back in 2002, when Jean-Marie Le Pen entered the presidential finals in France, it was considered a huge scandal. It was considered an aberration. And nowadays, his daughter garners support with a right-wing party, and I shouldn't say extreme right-wing, because I may be taken to court, as I hear that she's she's threatened to sue anybody who will slander her party.
Live transmission, you know.
Well, then I'm already in the have a problem on my hands and my lips. So this is no longer an aberration, and it is an indication of the extent to which the public conversation, not to say the debate, has steadily moved toward the right. You will customarily have a conservative and, let's say, the liberal, not to mince words, seated at the table, but the left-wing voice will be completely gone. On the other hand, the normalization, as it were, of the right-wing discourse is playing in the hands of the corporate interest and the international capital, to the extent that usually proto-fascist, fascist groups and movements focus on the so-called politics of identity rather than questioning the class structure and the difference between the agency and the structure as it translates into the institutional order. So they keep that quiet, but mostly tone down the anti-racist and anti-Semitic element and emphasize the anti-immigration sentiment that sits well with disoriented, insecure and scared population at large. And I think that the phenomena of the rising right wing can be observed across the European board, as I said, from the Italian Five Stars to the True Finns to the Golden Dawn in Greece and the Netherlands, likewise with the Phil Mertz. So you have the movements that are no longer the fringe movements, but considerably affect the public discussion and the terms in which the discussion is articulated. So never mind the economic conflict, let's translate that into a conflict between various distinct, often ethnically or linguistically grounded communities. And in that regard, I think the lack of the story that democracy was to spell out is something that is acutely felt. If, very briefly, we consider democracy as a myth, that is a story, a narrative, and the elections as the ritual that publicly enacts, strengthens, and solidifies the popular belief and trust in the story being told, then we do, though through clenched teeth, participate in the elections. We really don't know what story we support. We know that democracy may be the only game in town nowadays, yet nobody believes in it any longer. And yet, I would be loath to follow the ever so tempting example of the populist backlash against the European Union and what it stands for. Because it is very easy to toss the baby out together with the bathwater and conveniently forget that the advancement and the expansion of the European Union to the former communist countries, to the so-called post-communist countries, countries in transition, new democracies, what various names for the same thing, has attempted what has not been attempted before, and that is not to change the regime, political regime, but to change the society by providing the normative standards of the shared and lived experience. And to a certain degree, European Union has succeeded in doing that. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the European Union has, now that we have the benefit of hindsight, that we have 20-odd years behind since the annus mirabilis, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the disappearance of any alternative to the Western capitalist democratic order. I would go as far as to say that European Union is to a certain degree a victim of its own success, because this incremental change that was enacted and performed was performed in a technocratic manner, and it was. And it is now, only now, that we see that the financial markets lost patience with the protracted collective decision-making process, whereas on the other hand, the people have lost patience with globalization. We must not forget, and that's why I keep returning to that, that we discuss the deficiencies and the failures of the European Union and respective governments in the framework of a globalization. And there are numerous definitions for this elusive phenomenon, yet I think there are many worse than the following, that globalization is the process whereby the economic aspect of human life is emphasized to the detriment of the political aspect. And I think that this is what is happening today, that we understand that politically speaking we have very little choice. That's why the reluctance of people on the street, demonstrators like the one you pointed out, Ivan, in Bulgaria, who were not necessarily out to topple the government, but they wanted to be seen, and they wanted the government to be held accountable. And I think it's that sort of cynicism that we need to combat. Cynicism that says, yes, we do things wrong, so what? And that's something that is a novel phenomenon, because in the past, and I mean in the times of the Cold War, at least there was a faint effort to be polite, did you say? Civil, not ruffle any feathers, and not ask any difficult and thorny questions. But nowadays it seems that the gloves are off, and if you can detect, at least in my country, I can detect stirrings of the pursuit of what is vaguely called democratic socialism, direct democracy, all kinds of imperfect ideas that would mitigate against the dominant discourse that reduces the human being to the homo economicus. They do, I think, open up the space for what is the most difficult in enactment of so-called active citizenship. If active citizenship can be boiled down into three important steps that need to be made if one is to be an active citizen, then it is reflection, action, and a follow-up. And reflection and action have been done by the follow-up, and that is what you said, that you can tweet the revolution, but you can't tweet the process. And that is the most problematic and the most challenging thing. That is, what is to replace democracy if we really live in a post-democratic times characterized as they are by socialism for the rich, because it is socialization, that is the distribution of loss of the banks and not financial institutions, that is enjoyed by the 1%, whereas the other 99% only look on in amazement, disbelief, and ultimately anger. But anger, of course, can be channeled and manipulated in different directions, and I'm afraid that what we have seen so far in demonstrations across the south of Europe is an effort to combat that cynicism, is an effort to be radical in a sense that long time ago Welsh cultural critic Raymond Williams said, to be radical means to make the conditions for hope possible rather than cynicism convincing. We are today in the times when cynicism is very convincing.
Well, you touch a lot of relevant issues, so just very briefly before I pass the mic. So it means, in a way, it doesn't have to be immediately the criticism or very bad judgment about democracy per se, rather about democratic performance. Because even you, Ivan, wrote that even in Bulgaria, when the surveys were conducted, the recent events didn't deepen the distrust towards democracy. This is the first. And secondly, I think this sort of populism is different from the typical right-wing populism in 10 years ago. It's simply the result of dissatisfaction with established political actors, established political parties. Sometimes they either do not have agenda or have such a complicated agenda that you do not know what they really want. I would doubt to call Beppe Grillo as a right-wing populist, and people in his party. So they are very different faces, very many ideas. The only thing is that if it comes to governance or to governing, they are simply not that good. And then, well, what we see, and I think you are right also in this, that the discourse, the debate about globalism somehow puts aside the political dimension of how to organize society. But not only that, we are still living in the times of crisis. So if still the crisis is here, and if such a substantial part of population feels threatened and they have really problems to live with it, then they are not so much able to listen to other talks than just those basic talks. And I think this is a unique and threatening situation which doesn't have to last forever, but it's already 5 years. Right? It wasn't that big crisis shock and then the remedies and so on. It's here, and it's gradually somehow undermining that sort of important political debate, because people are not focusing, not concentrating, then just a guy like Beppe Grillo arrives and promises everything, and they say, okay, this is a new guy, and they will do the best for us. I saw you wanted to comment.
Yeah, no, I'm reminded of what Zizek said to the Occupy protest when he came to New York. He advised us not to let the issue of corruption distract us from our very systemic critique of capitalism and of democracy under capitalism. And I think this is what distinguishes the left protests today in the United States from the conservative right Tea Party protests. Both of them emerged from the anger over the bailouts in 2008, 2009, but the critique from the Tea Party, which itself has been co-opted by the Republican Party, the corporate Republicans in many ways, but the initial critique was something like, why should I have to pay for the mortgage of my neighbor who couldn't afford the house that they took out the loan for? Whereas the Occupy critique was, why should we have to pay for the crisis of the 1%? For their financial crisis, why should we be kicked out of our homes? And so by bringing it to corruption, it distracts us, I believe, from the main issue. As Ivan said, money in politics, corruption, that is a persistent issue throughout history. As long as elites have used the political process as an auction block, for their interests, there has been money in politics. That's nothing new. But what is distinctly angering about the current political situation for so many of us is that we have a government that continues to facilitate the class war upon young people, to continue to put us into more and more debt, to continue to degrade and to destroy the rights of workers to fundamentally organize. I mean, these basic rights that were won over a long struggle in the United States have been eroded in the last 30, 40 years, slowly and slowly, with the help of a very corrupt government. But that isn't the essence of it. The essence of it is the fact that we now live in a situation where we have a government that has been hijacked by corporate interests globally, not just in the United States, but globally, and it doesn't represent anymore the interests of the 99%. The election process as well has been hijacked, has been eroded, but that is just one symptom of a larger dysfunction. And so I think to say corruption alone is minimizing the problem and makes it seem like it's a simpler fix than it really is, and it would lead people to maybe say, well, we just have to get rid of the cronyism. We have to have a democracy under capitalism, but have it be less crony, less nepotistic.
Yes, your summary of criticism is deeper. We also heard about those 99%, and I think there are also some weaker sides of it, but it's not me to say the judgments here. Maybe Ivan would like to comment, and then we will go to the audience for the comments and questions.
Something important. There was a survey being done during the Wall Street protest among the Wall Street protesters. Are you going to agree to increase the taxes of the middle class? Not of the 1%, of the 99%. And majority said no. And I do believe this is the specificity of this crisis, because people like to compare with the Great Depression in the 1970s. In the Great Depression, people lost trust in market, but they gained the trust in government. In 1970s, people lost trust in government, but they gained trust in the market. Now you have a market failure which did not result in regaining the trust in government, even among the Wall Street protesters. Because if you want to go with a welfare state and so on, it's not enough basically to increase the taxes of 1%. I'm saying this because in my view this is very important, and when you go to our part of the world, and this is why for Eastern Europe, in my view at least, something very important is happening. Listen, Bulgaria is a poor place, the poorest country in the EU. The GDP of the country at the moment is not far away from what it was in 1989. It's slightly better on GDP per capita because there are less people, but we don't have an economic miracle. There was one thing that for all social groups and others was perceived as the major legitimation factor of change, and this was the open borders. People can travel, people can go, and now this is put under question. Because first, these old people in the villages, they said, our kids are traveling and we cannot see them anymore. Every fourth Bulgarian children on a school age is outside of the country. So the demographic fear is something very important and understudied in basically understanding this type of a backlash. And secondly, they said this open borders also means that foreigners, whom we don't like, are going to come. And from this point of view, I do believe this is a major story, because the delegitimation of transition is much deeper than basically said, you don't like the political class, which totally agree, but people do not have an alternative to democracy. And not simply people, elites do not have an alternative to democracy, because democracy is the only system where you can have a government which is weak and legitimate. If you can come with 7 or 8% growth, like the Chinese, you're not very much interested, are you democracy or autocracy? But if you cannot grow, better be a democracy.
Which again might also serve as a light in the tunnel. Yes, I think it's time to ask the audience for your questions. You heard the people who really know a lot about diagnosis and who are also thinking or acting in what I call the therapy or the cure. So, well, what I see that light. I do not see that much the faces and the figures and raising hands. So, if there is anyone who would like to comment or who would like to ask something, yeah, that helps. Okay, so now I see 3. So let's pick up 3 questions first, then the second, and then we will see. I think the organizers would welcome if you would kindly just introduce yourself, your name, and from where you are. Please, you can start. Could we get Mike?
Tim Snyder. So, since this was so much about mood and trust and protest, I wanted to ask a very boring question about institutions, because it seems to me that the subject, the implied subject of all of this, democracy, doesn't really exist, right, in either of the places we're talking about. So the problem with Europe is that the European Union is not a representational democracy. Therefore, nationally sovereign states are in this kind of middle position where all of the symbolic politics plays out at the national level. And this is just as true in England as it is, or Scotland for that matter, as it is in Macedonia or Bulgaria. National states are the natural theater for this sort of thing. But there's this dialectic where all issues of substance can always be referred back to Europe, whether that's actually correct or not. So it seems like this is another way that the European Union is a kind of victim of its own success. You can get so far without being a representational democracy, but if you remain where you are now with basically half or 3/4 sovereign states, naturally you're going to have a drift to the right. Because what half or 3/4 sovereign states can do is perform a theater of identity. They can't actually do anything, but they can perform a theater of identity, right? And until Europe actually is a representational democracy, it's not going to be sovereign in the eyes of the citizens of Europe. So so there's no European democracy. And there's not an American one either, right? I mean, but the reason why, I mean, I may disagree with you about why that is. I mean, the reasons why are basic institutional ones, that most votes in American elections don't count because of gerrymandering and because of campaign finance, which means that in effect our elected representatives are responding to people who are not voting for them. But I mean, to me, it strikes me that that's an institutional question. I mean, we can protest that as much as we want, or we can educate ourselves about it as much as we want. But until we take the institutions seriously, I don't honestly actually see how you're different than the Tea Party on these things. I mean, I see you guys, I'm afraid, as like the left-wing annex to the Tea Party, because there's no way that you just can't be on the left if you don't believe in institutions. It's impossible to be on the left in an American context and in general. If you think the answer is education, protest, trust, whatever, and you don't care about the institutions, you're basically with the Tea Party. I mean, whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, you're the left-wing spokespeople for the Tea Party. Because in America, the right means anti-institution. And you can't be anti-institution objectively, to use that famous distinction, without being on the right. So, I mean, that's where you guys are. And I think the answer, you know, insofar as one cares, use the word democracy over and over again. But we don't have it, and you can't actually have it without institutional change. It doesn't matter how nice we are, how young we are. Youth especially, don't count on that. It's only institutional changes which will matter. And that's that was the huge disappointment, frankly, with Wall Street.
Yeah. Well, thanks for adding this institutional element into the debate. Originally, I was thinking that we will pick up several questions, but it was also the comment. So let's stay with your comment and your question. Who of you would like to respond?
Just briefly, I think that was on the mark, and I believe that I made a statement or saying that I guarded against the anti-institutional attitude when I said that we should not forget the benefits brought about by the European Union. But there is at the core of it, or foundational dilemma or conundrum of the European Union, is of course the ordeal between territorially bound democracy that is delineated by the borders of the nation state on the one hand, and of course the pan-continental EU institutions, or in all the preceding incarnations of what today passes for European Union. And in that regard, I think that both statements, vision, alternative program that would call for a true Europeanization of politics, reclaiming it from what has been its quote-unquote natural environment, and that is the realm of a nation state, elevating it to the European level. I see no reason whatsoever why, for instance, in Portugal, where there is a dearth of, the lack of liberal-minded parties, why the Portuguese, with that particular bent of mind, would not be able to cast their votes for the European-wide Liberal Party should it ever occur. So that it wouldn't be, even the representatives in the European Union would not be elected only on the territory of the nation state, but across board. That would be one thing, and I think it may be beneficial. But the dilemma of how to make what is essentially local into a global, and that is the democratic order, remains with us. Now, whether democracy is more of an idea, whether it's a desiderata, whether it's a telos that we need to pursue, that may very well be the case. And I think that the overwhelming level of mistrust would give credence to that claim, but it would also turn us into the informed optimists, which is to say pessimists. But I would, as I said, not want to go for that route because it is easy one. And I do want to insist on the importance of both three: reflection, action, and the follow-up. And it is the follow-up which is the debate about the alternative model that would force the political elites to seek the question that would be worthy of what the state stands for. What does the state stand for? It is the organized power that is designed to provide the maximum quality of life rather than the profit. And the fact that under the aegis of the globalization, the political state has become, in part, a corporation itself, and in part in the service of the international capital or corporations, doesn't help either. But having said that, it doesn't mean that I would give up the political effort and opt for the anti-politics in which they're all the same, all the politicians are the same, because in that dark night of the sameness, all the cows are black.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you also wanted to say something.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you. Just in brief response to
Yes.
this idea that Occupy Wall Street
the
is
rich
anti.
comment usually brings rich answers. So if you promise to be brief, it will help the others to
Yeah.
somehow.
I just don't think it's true that Occupy Wall Street is anti-institution. The institutions that it is anti are, for the most part, the large nonprofits and foundations that are tied completely to the corporations that we protest, and also in another part to the Democratic Party, which we felt has been so subservient to Wall Street. But there are new radical institutions that are already emerging out of these protests in just the second, third year of its existence. And I think there's a lot of precedent in the United States for the creation of new democratic institutions that actually enrich democracy. The prime example that I'm thinking of are the freedom schools of the 1960s in Alabama and Mississippi. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in 2012, in the last presidential election, African Americans in the United States voted in higher percentage than Caucasians, than white people, for the first time in history. That's only 50 years since they gained the full universal right to vote effectively in our country. And the freedom schools were the institutions that trained young people to be able to pass the poll exams and vote in the South of the United States. So these new institutions, like the school I founded, the Paul Robeson Freedom School, I believe are the institutions that the New Left is going to create to enrich democracy, to make democracy more participatory and more real in that sense.
Yes, I think this is a nice example of a network of institutions which gradually translate itself into political action or political change. Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think your observation is absolutely correct in the sense of the absence of an identity, a sovereign identity for Europe, which also translates into a lack of a sense of citizenship or belonging or being part of a democratic process. I mean, sometimes the democratic deficit at EU level is maybe overstated, and it's I mean, the constant criticism is that the various institutions, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament, are not really accountable to anybody, and that they are run by faceless bureaucrats. I think that's probably an extreme interpretation. The Council is made up of ministers who are part of governments that are elected by the people. The European Parliament has been directly elected for a number of decades now, albeit on the basis of state boundaries. And the Commission, commissioners are nominated by national governments and they have to be approved by the Parliament, and that is becoming a more and more rigorous process each time. And I think it'll be a lot more rigorous next summer when we have the next round of nominations to the Commission. But that doesn't take away from the fact that to bridge the gap, I mean, Brussels is perceived to be and is geographically very, very remote from many, many European citizens. So we have to find ways to make it closer, more relevant, and to give our citizens a sense of participation, of ownership over decision making at EU level. And that probably does mean cross-border elections. I think it's a highly sensible concept that you would have members of Parliament at European level who are elected on a pan-European basis, not simply on a national basis. There's a lot that can be done in terms of efficiencies in the other institutions. I don't know that it's sustainable to have, 28 ministers meeting to discuss transport, 28 ministers meeting to discuss sport, and so on and so forth. I also think vetoes from member states are profoundly anti-democratic. So there are a lot of things that need to happen. There's been a lot of discussion and debate. My political family, the EPP, have advanced for quite some time the concept of a directly elected president of the Commission, elected by all of the people of Europe. I don't know if it'll make any difference, quite frankly. I think it has the potential to, but I think other ways of engaging citizens, social media, the internet, the power of the internet can be destructive, but I think it can also be very, very positive. And I think that there's a lot that can be done in that respect as well. But there is no simple solution. On the other hand, when you look at how the European Union is discussed and debated at a national level, it's not necessarily always healthy, and I mean, I think it's been sold in different ways in different member states. In Germany, it was always the sense of responsibility. It was always the sense of being pro-European and being part of some greater European entity was a positive thing. In my country, it was sold on the basis of structural funds and the common agricultural policy and payments, basically. And when referenda on various European issues had to be passed, it was on the basis of how much money could we get out of it. So even the vision for Europe is entirely different depending on what part of Europe you're in. So I think that also needs to be addressed. When things go wrong in member states, Europe is blamed, as is happening at the moment, which frustrates me a lot. There's a huge amount of frankly racism in some member states in terms of how other nationalities across Europe are perceived at the moment, and that's fueled by national politicians in many instances. So this is a particularly sensitive time, and there's a lot of frustration, and a lot of it justified. But I think it's very simplistic to simply blame the European Union for the problems that we have. Many of them, caused or at least significantly contributed to at domestic level, and I think that the solutions are far more complex. So certainly, I don't shy away from the idea of reforming our institutions at EU level. It also needs to happen at regional and national level. And I think that you've made the point very, very well that at national level we're almost in a sense of denial. We're still pretending to be fully sovereign states when we pooled our sovereignty in the case of my country 40 years ago, and have been gradually pooling more and more sovereignty ever since then. I think that's a good thing. I don't have a difficulty with that, but we need to be honest with our citizens about it, and maybe more honest with ourselves as well. So.
I just want to comment on something which in my view is very important, which Tim put about the EU. We had a lot of talk about the democratic deficit in the EU. It's fine. But what is much more interesting is what's happening to this symbolic power of the nation states, which in the time of crisis you basically referred to. Just to give you the example of two totally different narratives. When people in February in Bulgaria went to protest against the high electricity prices, they have been singing all these famous songs from the 19th century liberation movement. Why did they believe that the government is going to take their side? Not because they do believe that they're voters, probably also this, but not to a great extent, but because they do believe that they're Bulgarians. And because most of these companies have been owned by foreigners, they basically said, listen, we are Bulgarians, you're Bulgarian government, we hope that we're going to do something for us. When people on the streets of Sofia went to protest against disappointment of the counterintelligence guy, they have been saying, we are Europeans, you cannot treat us like this. In Europe, they're not doing this like this. So you have split even on the narrative of the legitimation of protest. And this is a major story, because this goes to a topic which none of us is ready to discuss. At the moment of failure and crisis, you go back to wars that we have fought together. By the way, I don't know how many of you have been following this famous story when at Miliband was said something and I don't know what, and one of the British tabloids attacked his father. And the attack was, he was a foreigner, and when he was 20 years old, he has been very critical to Britain and the British political system. How he was defended? People said he fought in the war. He came, he was an immigrant, but he fought against Hitler in the English army, and it was over. My idea is, how we're going to defend somebody who said something critical in his 20 years about our states when there is not the war in which we have been fighting? And I do believe that this kind of a connection between war and symbolic legitimacy, which is not based on performance, because on performance it's easy. If the institutions functions, of course they create a certain level of legitimacy and so on. But when they stop functioning, then you are basically asking the question, in order to change institutions, towards what kind of a pool of symbolic power you're referring to. And I do believe this is going to be a major problem in Europe, because, and this is my last sentence, strangely enough, the trust in the European Union in West and East and much more North and South was based on totally two different relations towards the national governments and attitudes, and this is very much in the Eurobarometer, so it's not something that I'm saying which is a guess. Germans trust European Union to the extent that they do believe that their national government, whom they trust, can influence the European Union. Bulgarians trust the European Union because they don't trust their national government, so they do believe Brussels, nevertheless, how bad it is going to be better than ours. The problem is that this is starting to change. Probably not Brits, but the French don't believe anymore that they can shape European Union. And Bulgarians are not sure anymore. Is Brussels a counter, basically controlling power with respect to their national government, or simply the ally of their government when the government is mistreating them?
Fortunately enough, they still do not consider the Union as the secret ally of the bad government. Yes, so there was a question, and then please, and no, there was a gentleman behind.
Well, you mentioned in your discussion the development in Slovenia. Now, and you spoke of the transition. There was a transition in Slovenia, but remarkably different from other states in our area. Because actually, as it was the most important step, was the Declaration of Independence, which was a major thing for Slovenia, because before Slovenia was the richest and most successful republic of former Yugoslavia. And so one thought that one could go with the same system forever. And the reforms in Slovenia were much slower and not so deep, and the exchange of the people in charge was much lesser than in all other countries. And actually this was a failure, as we found out, and the former most successful country, Slovenia, fell in a great difficulty. And I asked myself if it doesn't has a reason in the development in the 90s. That's the first thing. Second, there was mentioned that people in the 70s didn't trust the government, they trusted the market, then they trusted the market and not the government, now they don't trust either. Well, we have to admit that, especially in Europe, but in the United States, the governments are the main culprits of the economic crisis, not the nasty banks, not the capitalists at the Wall Street, because it was the governments who definitely, in the last 25 years, it's quarter of a century, systematically, for political reasons, indebted their countries. They couldn't bear to face in face of their voters that the growth would be less. And so to prod the growth, they prodded the banks to give credits and gave and indebted their own countries more and more and more, which has, of course, one day had to end. And so I do think there's the distrust to the government is at least as legitimate as the distrust to the banks, because the governments are the main culprits of the 25 years. I don't I don't think that the capitalists of Wall Street are benefactors and especially kind and charitable people. But the economic crisis was caused by the governments, not by the banks.
Thank you, Karl Schwarzenberg, for this comment. You wanted to... And yes, no. Moment, microphone. Už to ide.
Skúsim, nie som zvyknutý hovoriť cez mikrofón, ďakujem. Možno, že sa mi bude ľahšie.
Speak in a mic. I wanted to use this room to say something. There are not so many people who want to speak. Okay. So I want to comment the situation in a free way. I think that freedom makes its own choice.
Máme aparatúru, takže možno...
So now we have equipment and I won't get tired. Those... We all know problems of society. Democracy has failed. People did not fulfill what they were supposed to, and but I want to specific. We all are familiar with the problems of society. I do not want to repeat myself. You may look at me and think that I am saying things that are awkward, but I don't know why. I believe that this is called a free forum, and I think forum is a very nice word, and I am very specific. I say that it is a very nice title, and the word forum is the word which also implies freedom, and it is the word of forum that should also result in getting the best people to the management of the forum. I do not know what brought you here, what if you know one another because of the 17th of September. I don't know if there is anything funny about what I have said. We can discuss the problems. I believe that we should, at the same time, we should not fool ourselves. Maybe the gentleman would like to ask something. Okay, let me now. Thank you. This is a contribution by a person who is asking whether these words can be transformed into an action and whether they will have a result. This is characteristic of this forum, that people may come here and may join the discussion. And the gentleman says that if you are looking for right people, I could help you. Martin says that if you wait until the end, maybe you would get your answer, but you are free to go as you wish.
Ľudia nehryznú, pravda nezabíja. A ja nie som z Bratislavy, tiež mám svojich povinností.
I invite all of you to come to a square in Bratislava tomorrow at 5 p.m. Martin says we still have a possibility to continue in our discussion if there is a question or a comment.
Secretary of KDH and also Vice President of Forum of Christian Institutions. Just a couple of, I hope, brief comments. We are tonight discussing the principles of democracy and the prospects of democracy. Just a very short reminding of first month of after the revolution of '89. I was member of so-called Council of Slovak Television, and there was something like 100 most various people representing most various social orientations, directions, and this was the first disillusion of democracy, because it was like many angle powers going, or forces going on various directions, but nothing could be moved, you know. So if you can well play the game, you can by a very small force put the direction of the whole system. Maybe so. Democracy is not easy, and you must know the game rules. Most striking idea what was told for me in this panel was that we don't need to change the regime, we need to change society. Yes, I believe Mr. Aleš told it, and this is very striking. But how to change it? And concerning the mistrust, the main denominator of this was mistrust, and I am asking, where could we find the stable point, the reference point? I believe that in postmodern society, when everything is being relativized, where to find this stable point where we can rely on and and can develop, you know. Thank you. So these basic views, which maybe you can reflect. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for clearly formulated questions. Before you will respond, are there any other people who would like? No. So. Yeah. Yes.
Just a brief response, Mr. Schwarzenberg, at the back. Yes, you are correct in assessing and evaluating the trajectory of post-independent Slovenia since 1991. It has been like the rant of the litter that constantly asks the teacher, ask me, I know the answer. This was Slovenia up until 2004 and a little past. But to a large degree, I attribute it, and I'm by no means alone in that assumption, I attribute it to the fact that the successive governments, regardless of the orientation, have been very reluctant to go into a full-scale deregulation, liberalization, deregulation and liberalization, and of course privatization. They have held back the large state-owned services, exercising what I believe in a very traditional sense that it is the domain and the remit of the state, and providing the services that facilitate the common good. And it was only after, belatedly, given the European context where it was the advent of Margaret Thatcher that translated the Reagan-inspired revolution, if that's the word, onto the European side of the Atlantic, advancing deregulation, liberalization, and privatization. So that when that hit Slovenia, then the banks did play a considerable role. They were, I don't think that, with all due respect, I think that to let the banks off the hook and laying the blame the threshold of the government would be an exercise in excessive civility toward the banks. If anything, then just for the sake of the old and rehashed argument, I think that it wasn't for nothing that during the demonstrations over the past couple of years on the streets of my country, that old Brechtian slogan has surfaced and lodged itself in the minds of people who have probably heard of Bertolt Brecht for the first time during the demonstrations, when his slogan became popular, that the robbery of a bank is nothing compared to the establishment of a bank. And I think that does not necessarily show just the sort of populist, leftist, anti-institutional attitude, but it shows that Slovenia is obviously no exception in the mistrust.
Okay. I was just thinking.
I don't want to be too long.
No, I was just thinking. This reminded me another way how to approach it, and it was rather a joke when the well-known thief was repeatedly arrested, and they were asking him, "Why do you rob banks?" And his response was, "Because that's where the money is." So, well, I think we are approaching to the end. Thank you all for sharing with us what I promised, what we promised at the beginning: the reflections, the comments, a sort of inspiration, a small light in the end of the tunnel. And I hope we, with your contributions, can think again and again, what should the critical mass of possible changes do, and how they should do it in order to have our next debate in the next year slightly more optimistic. I think our panelists deserve really our deep thanks for their contribution. Thanks.